We move now onto the employment session, focusing on what it will be like to work in the future and what technology holds in store for us. I think that's quite exciting, a little scary, but definitely very exciting. We start with an interview with Joseph Stiglitz, who was awarded the 2001 Prize in Economic Sciences. And this time, the interviewer is Adam.
So welcome to this interview. It's a real pleasure to have you with us for our dialogue in Pretoria, Joseph Stiglitz.
Nice to be here. I wish I could be there in person.
Next time, we hope. This interview comes at the beginning of a session on the future of employment. And so beginning with a vast and rather difficult question, how do you feel that employment in the future will be most different?
Well, I think it's going to be different for different parts of the labor force. And we've seen that very clearly in the context of COVID-19. Those who can work on Zoom have been working from home, have been traveling all over the world without moving, and have been almost undisturbed. In fact, have had, in some cases, even a more productive time. On the other hand, for those engaged in face-to-face work, it's been a very difficult period. So I think what we're going to see, that kind of divide, and a lot of discussion now about a K-shaped recovery, I think there's going to be a K-shaped effect on the world of work in very much the same way. I think those who can engage in Zoom and that kind of remote work will find work in some ways better. They can make a choice of travel or not. They will save on commuting time. And, all the studies show that that's the worst aspect of anybody's life, commuting. So in some ways, it's going to be an enormous improvement in standards of living. On the other hand, what we've seen at the other end is a level of precariousness that is extraordinarily disturbing.
So if technology is going to be the answer to allow people's working lives to improve, how do you think we ensure that the benefits of technology are shared most equitably around the globe?
That's another very important issue, because the control of many of these technologies is by a relatively few firms, particularly in the United States. And a minimum to ensure that the benefits are shared more widely is digital taxation, making sure that the enormous profits that many of these companies are made are accessible. One of the things that globalization has done has made it easier for these companies to avoid taxes everywhere. So we have two issues: one, to make sure they get taxed, and secondly, to make sure that a reasonable share of that tax revenue accrues to those in developing countries and emerging markets. There's a second issue, though, that I think is also very important, is global regulation. These tech giants are very powerful, and they are setting the regulatory framework that in a way that benefits themselves. And that obviously is going to result in their getting more and more of the benefits, but also confronting the rest of the world with a lot of harms. We see all those digital harms, and they make money out of incitement, out of political manipulation, but they undermine our democracies and our sense of social solidarity. So we need stronger global regulation.
Do you think that's achievable? Do you think we're inevitably moving into a world where there's a co-governance by corporations? Or can
No, I think it is achievable. And I think, maybe 5 years ago, I would have been more doubt about it. But the abuses in the last 5 years in every dimension, from political manipulation to not paying taxes, tax avoidance, tax evasion, whatever you call it, have angered so many people in our democracies that if our democracy survives, then I think it will be regulated.
And again, do you think that jobs for everybody who wants them is going to be achievable in a future where we have an ever-expanding global population?
Growth of the population is right now centered over the next 50 years, 75 years in Africa. The demographic transition has happened very slowly in Africa. And that issue of the demographic transition clearly is going to be one of the things that needs to be on the agenda. But there's a broader issue, let me say, for the next, from a global point of view, for the next 30, 40 years, we are going to need enormous investments to make the green transition, to provide infrastructure for Africa, to provide for urbanization, all these things that are necessary if we're going to succeed in our ambitions of saving the planet and raising standards of living, are going to need lots of labor. Mm. So in spite of the advances of artificial intelligence, robotization, for the next 30 years, I believe, quite strongly that if we can get our system to work well, there will be enough jobs. Eventually, we'll have to face the kind of question that Keynes talked about almost 100 years ago of what would the world be like when we are so productive that people want more and more leisure. But we're not there yet. And so the world of work is the world that we're going to be confronting. And the question is, how do we make that world of work?
Does the phrase "the future of work" fill you with hope or fear?
Both. It fills me with hope because I think that at least for significant fractions of the population, work can become more meaningful. The concern is we won't have enough jobs. And the jobs that we create for those who are less educated will be more exploitive in the way that Uber and Lyft are engaged in today. That the imbalances of power will make work for those at the bottom even less satisfying. And that's why, to me, what I call the progressive agenda is not just about greater equality of income and wealth, but greater equalities of standards of living. And an important part of standards of living for most of us is our work. Hmm. And to make work more attractive, less onerous, seems to be one of the things that should be high on our agenda.
It doesn't seem so much to ask to be decently treated, does it?
No, it doesn't. And, each of us in our own relations with our workers should try to do that. But it's at the level of the system and the failure of the system that I worry most, because it's obvious that many companies don't do that.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and it's so kind of you to take part in our dialogue. So.
Real pleasure for me too.
Next, we have a talk from economic historian Joel McKeer, professor at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, exploring what we can learn about the future effects of technology from studying past and also present in the present industrial revolution. So his talk is entitled The Past and Future of Work. That will lead directly into a conversation on the impact of technology, in which Joel will be joined by Zainab Usman, who is director of the African program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This conversation will be moderated by Rose Phillips, who you have, of course, already met.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Can people hear me? Is this... All right, good. So let me just get started. So here is a very simple and almost naive question, I would think, which is, if we believe, as I surely do, that the rate of technological progress will continue in the future at the pace that's been taken for, say, the past 200 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or even faster, I think. It's a legitimate question, a little bit concern to ask what would happen to work and what would happen to jobs. That is, in fact, precisely what my former teacher, Joseph Stiglitz, just said. And to be more specific, is it possible that widespread technological unemployment would occur nationwide or even worldwide? And so for an economic historian, the first reaction is, we've seen this movie and more than once. In the past, fairly remote past, workers often were concerned that they would be replaced by machines and that these machines would make them redundant in some way. And so obviously their response was to try to resist technological progress and to resist mechanization to protect their jobs. So this is the most famous example, and everybody's seen these stories in high school. These are the famous Luddites in Nottinghamshire in England in the beginning of the 19th century. And you can see, a guy here with a big hammer and two guys with big hammers next to a framing machine, and they're breaking it because they're worried about their work as frame knitters. Okay? And it's not just the workers themselves, even economists, such as they were at the time, were concerned with the matter. So here's the greatest of them all, David Ricardo, the master of economics at the time. And basically, in 1821, he writes a letter to a colleague in which he writes that, if machinery could do all the work that labor now does, there wouldn't be any demand for labor, and nobody would have any money, so nobody would be entitled to consume anything who was not a capitalist and who couldn't hire or buy a machine. That's a very serious concern. Now, to be fair, I think he realized that this was a rather restrictive theoretical case, and that in the long run, he thought higher productivity would actually lead to more savings and investment and eventually rising demand for labor. Now, as it turned out, both the Luddites and Ricardo were wrong. The concern at least in the longer run, turned out to be misplaced. So that didn't help people sort of in what we call the transitional dynamic. So if you had, some of them obviously were thrown out of work, particularly the famous handloom weavers. But the sons and daughters of these handloom weavers and other people whose jobs were made redundant by technological progress, they found jobs elsewhere. They became railroad engineers, electricians, telegraph operators, pillar makers, department store clerks, all kinds of jobs that did not exist in 1800 or even in 1820. Or they had the option of emigrating, which a lot of them, of course, did. And I think what happened at that time seems to be almost a chronic problem in people observing the labor market. Observers always seem to be terribly pessimistic about it for some reason. People worried about jobs and the demand for labor, and the fact that it wasn't happening, and there's no evidence that this has any long-term technological unemployment, that doesn't seem to persuade the doomsayers one bit. And it's not just in the dystopian science fiction novels in which you have a huge, massive group of people who basically don't do anything, as in sort of Kurt Vonnegut's classic from the 1950s called Player Piano, and many other books like that. So these are sort of dystopian science fiction novels. And the fact that it doesn't seem to have been true, it didn't seem to convince these people. And, you know, I can always reminded of the attributed dictum to Josh Billings, the American comedian, who said, you know, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. I mean, that might be a good description of times in many ways. So here you have another example. This is from 1928. This is the New York Times that you will see. And, you know, you can't read this very small print, but you can see the top. It's sort of the prevalence of unemployment greatly increased with greatly increased industrial output points to the influence of labor-saving devices as an underlying cause of idle hand. So this is 1928, just on the eve of the Great Depression. And of course, unemployment that a year later went up, but not because of technological change, but because of other things. And then, you know, 12 years after this article, you see another new, and it brings back the story. Does machine displace men in the long run? And so you can also see a kind of a robot sitting there, mechanical improvement. And, you know, and I don't think there's any serious economist who believe that the Great Depression was caused by technological change by itself, but people were still concerned about it. And so here you have, we will go ahead, you know, another 25 years, and there's a very famous letter written by a whole bunch of intellectuals, including some well-known economists such as Gunnar Myrdal, of course, the Nobel Prize winner, and Robert Heilbronner, as well as Linus Pauling, one of the few people who actually won two Nobel Prizes. And they wrote this letter to President Johnson in 1964, worried about what they call at the time the cybernation revolution. I think we still know what that is, although we wouldn't use that term, and that this would lead to increasing levels of unemployment. So here you see a copy of the letters and what the so-called triple revolution was. I'm not going to get into that, but the concern is still alive. Now, you know, the odd thing is it didn't happen. The US economy didn't collapse. Evidence that the streets were filled with millions of desperate, unemployable ex-farmers and ex-factory workers. And you know, basically economists know why. The first is the growth of the service sector and the emergence of a whole bunch of new occupations and tasks that didn't exist, but that were made possible by technology. And secondly, I think it's also true that the productivity growth that's supposed to make workers redundant was relentless, but it was relatively slow and gradual, you know, a few percentage points a year. So labor markets, excuse me, had time to adjust. And so agriculture declined, elevator operators were made redundant, but because it didn't all happen in one day, these people found alternative employment by and large. But the fear hasn't disappeared. There's still a lot of people who feel that a great concern about the future. And there's sort of two things that are happening here, which are not entirely consistent, okay? One is that jobs today are much worse than in the past. You know, there's a book by an anthropologist called David Graeber, who actually is actually called Bullshit Jobs. And then the concern is even those jobs disappear in the future, and that will be even worse. So that's almost like the famous joke about two Jews complaining in some hotel, you know, that, hey, the food is really terrible here, and secondly, the portions are really small. You know, I mean, I think there is no basis for this, but the truth of it is, ladies and gentlemen, is that in these days, especially in the United States, I must say, it doesn't sound so astonishing that so many people believe something that ain't so. But, and here comes the big but, okay? Is this time different? I mean, is it possible that guys like me who study history are basically going to be refuted because the future ain't going to be like the past? No, Robert Skidelsky, you know, famously warned us in 2013 that if we keep going like this, we will run out of jobs. And so we know what the technological waves of the future look like. I mean, it's not just that, but that's the most sort of salient phenomenon. And we're talking about some kind of combination of machine learning and artificial intelligence and robotics, and what we're doing now, which is sort of telepresence or virtual contact. And that a lot of people will just basically lose their jobs, and that they would become these sort of unemployable drones that dystopian novels worry about. And so let me just do a little bit of analysis here. So these are actually two separate questions. The first is, does technological progress cause a long-term decline in the demand for labor? And if so, at what scale? Is this at the level of an industry or a sector or the entire economy? And will the system eventually adjust to full employment, possibly with lower wages? And the second thing, which is in the short and medium run, is that even if in the long run, the demand for labor is unchanged, so that everybody who wants a job will get a job, maybe in the short and medium run, we'd still get a lot of frictional unemployment because there are mismatches. So we have certain skills, but the new technology demands different skills. And if the skills don't match, there will not be a job, and you'd still get unemployment, even so employers don't seem to be able to find the workers they need. So here are basically two things to think about without getting into any of the sort of weeds here. The first is that it's not clear that these so-called smart machines or robots actually are substitutes for labor, so that they replace workers, or that they are complements in the sort of standard sense that economists mean, which is that they make labor more productive. And if they make labor more productive, they may actually increase the demand for labor, which depend on a bunch of elasticities I'm not going to bore you with. But the other thing is that I think is often overlooked, except by my friends at MIT, which is that wholly new sources of labor demand are being created elsewhere by technological innovation. So, the system creates jobs that nobody ever dreamed about before. And we all know what's causing these, environmental and public health shocks. Let me say no more because you all know what I'm talking about, but also rising incomes and changing demography, which I'll say something about in a second, okay? What we know is...
Hi.
Yes.
Here.
Hello, Ro.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Joel, my apologies for interrupting you. I know that as a professor of history and as a professor of economics, you have so much wisdom to share, but we have limited time, unfortunately. So if you don't mind, if I may ask you a question. You were talking about the Luddites, and you say, is the future going to be a little bit the same as the past? And I do wonder, the world feels a little bit like it is on a knife's edge. We have had the Arab Spring in the north of Africa. We have had fears must fall in the south of Africa, where people are concerned, especially young people, around job security. Are you at all worried now around the disillusionment that we see amongst our young people? Joel, that's for you a question.
Well, as I said, there is a great deal of concern and fear, not just among young people, so it's particularly marked, but it's also among older people who are afraid of being replaced by machines, or for some other reason losing their jobs. And of course, the older you are, the harder it is to be retrained, as I full well know now. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. And if the new technology is going to demand different, then that's a concern for everybody, not just for younger people. I would say this. Stiglitz mentioned this, and this I think is really critical. It is true, of course, that in many places of the world, particularly in Africa, there's a great deal of concern among younger people about not being able to find jobs. And there's certainly particularly, I think, among university graduates, as it turns out. But we have to keep in mind that the demographic transition means that relative to the population, the proportion of younger people is declining everywhere in the world, except, as Joe said, in Africa, which has been slow to undergo a demographic transition. But if you look at Europe and now at the United States as well, and soon and certainly at China and in Korea and in Japan, birth rates have been low for a long time, and the number of younger people relative to the population is declining. It may well be that it's not so much that they can find jobs. We can't find enough of them to man the jobs that are already there. That will require, of course, wiser management than we've had so far. But I think you can see this happening already in Europe. And, you know, the great irony of our time is not that if people can't find jobs. The great irony of our time, and the one that I really get angry about, is that these are people, particularly in Africa, but also in South Asia, who need jobs. In the industrialized world, we need these people to come and fill those jobs because we don't have enough young people. So the obvious solution that the economists would say is have these people migrate. But then you start running into the tribalism and the racism and the sort of anti-immigrant sentiments that you start seeing all over the industrialized world. And you realize that this is going to be politically and socially a sort of obvious solution that an economist would think of, may be very difficult to achieve. And that's what's causing me to stay awake at night.
Okay, yeah. It keeps me awake at night as well, Joel. Zainab, early hours of the morning for you. I wonder, just turning to Africa, what do you think are the opportunities and the risks that these new technologies present us?
Well, thank you for having me here, Rose. So I see at least two sets of opportunities and risks for African countries in terms of what these new technologies pose to them. The first set of opportunities and risks operates through the mechanism of, I would say, FDI flows to manufacturing industries in African countries. So here there is an opportunity available to Africa to capture manufacturing, foreign direct investment due to rising wages in East Asia, especially China, as it becomes upper middle income. Now, I think it was December last year or early this year, China crossed the threshold to become upper middle income. You know, it has a per capita income now of $10,000. So, you know, there's an opportunity there for African countries to capture that manufacturing FDI. And this is because also manufacturing constitutes just around 8% of total employment in Africa on average, and around 10% of value added. And already we're seeing some countries are paving the way. For example, Ethiopia, which has around 13 industrial parks, including Bole, Lemi, Hawassa, and Mekele, which all house manufacturing firms that produce apparel for exports to Europe and North America. But the Ethiopia situation is really not widespread. So there's an opportunity there, but it is narrowing. Now, the risk here is really not that digital technologies could have worker displacing disruptions in Africa, as we are seeing in other parts of the world, because the sectors that are susceptible to this kind of worker displacing disruption are very, very small. You know, again, manufacturing is just around 10% of value added in many African countries. So the risk, however, is that technology could combine with certain geopolitical impulses. For example, the need to secure critical supply chains, as we've seen during this pandemic. You know, these are discussions that are animating public discourse in Europe, in North America, and other parts of the world. So this kind of combination of new technologies and also geopolitical concerns could result in reshoring of manufacturing production to the home countries of investors, rather than having this FDI move to low-wage jurisdictions as you have in other parts of parts of Africa. Meaning that in these countries, in the home countries of investors, they could actually have widespread adoption of robotics and automation to offset the higher wages in these countries. So that's one set of risks and opportunities. Another set to quickly mention is that within the African continent, technology adoption, including digital technologies, could actually increase productivity of workers and firms. Now, rising productivity is very important because it could allow firms to expand and create productive jobs. And for the informal sector in particular, they could become more formal as they become more productive. Now, you have to remember that within the African continent, informality is such a huge factor, right? It is prevalent across most African countries. It constitutes up to 40% of GDP in some countries and absorbs around 80% of workers, mostly in agriculture. And I'll give you an example with Nigeria, which is Africa's largest economy, where there are 41.5 million micro, small, and medium scale enterprises. And of these, 80% of them are informal, and 99% of these 41.5 million micro, small, and medium scale enterprises are micro enterprises, which employ less than 10 people per firm. And collectively, these micro, small, and medium scale enterprises in Nigeria account for more than 70% of total employment. So technology adoption in this context can help increase productivity of the firms, but also of the workers, to the extent that it allows them to increase their capabilities. These capabilities could be managerial and accounting skills or streamlining business processes and things like that. But the risk is also in this context, technology adoption, if it ends up exacerbating a kind of divide, it could actually entrench incumbents, especially the medium and large enterprises, to the detriment of micro enterprises. And actually, there's a study that shows us that this might be happening in some countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania. So very quickly to conclude, I want to mention that technology can help, but it is not the only solution to the productivity challenge in African countries. As when you look at most enterprise surveys, they show that the top 3 concerns for micro, small, and medium scale enterprises in Africa tend to be threefold. It's electricity access, reliable electricity access. It's access to credit and finance. And then it's something along the lines of corruption or predatory taxes. So technology can help, but it is not the only solution.
Thank you, Zainab. I have to draw this conversation to a close. We can, of course, convert the digital divide into a digital dividend, but only if we combine the intelligence of machines with the ingenuity of human beings. It's Picasso that said machines are actually quite stupid. They only have answers. It's human beings that must ask the better questions. Technology can help, but we must lead the way. Joel, Zainab, thank you for your time.